If the following process is not within your skill set, we highly recommend taking the fork to a professional cycle mechanic for installation. SUPER73 will not be held responsible for damages done during installation, and we prefer our riders to be safe. Before beginning the installation, please read the instruction manual to familiarize yourself with the process. You'll need the following tools to perform the installation: a 3mm Allen wrench, a 4mm Allen wrench, a 5mm Allen wrench, a 6mm Allen wrench, an 8mm Allen wrench, a 13mm open wrench, a 10mm open wrench, a 15mm socket wrench, a shock pump, and a torque wrench. Some additional items: zip tie cutters or scissors, a rubber mallet. Included in the air fork assembly, a front fender bracket, a corresponding fender bracket hardware, a 10mm steer tube spacer, a post-mount brake caliper bracket for the OG model, a brake caliper attachment screws, 3 zip ties, and bump stops. Phase 1. Prep for installation. Start by disconnecting both brake sensors from the wiring harness. Next, clip all necessary zip ties that hold the front brake line to the frame. Using a 5mm Allen wrench, remove the front brake caliper from the caliper bracket at the lower portion of the fork. Note that the bracket won't be needed on the new suspension fork. Using a 4mm Allen wrench, remove the front brake lever mount from the handlebar and place the front brake assembly aside for reinstallation. Remove the rear brake lever mount from the handlebar, pull through the fork assembly, and leave carefully to the side. Note that fully removing the rear brake assembly is not necessary. Disconnect the wiring harness from the controller by pulling the male and female plugs straight away from each other. Some force may be necessary, but be gentle. The headlight removal may vary per model. Please disregard any headlight instructions for the Z1 model. For the S1 model, disconnect the plug from the headlight to the controller by pulling the male and female connectors straight away from each other. Remove the headlight by removing the 2 screws that hold the bracket onto the underside of the top crown. Keep the current headlight bracket on the headlight for reinstallation on the suspension fork. Using a 5mm Allen wrench, remove the handlebar from the assembly by removing the 4 screws that hold the handlebar clamp in place. Your display and wiring harness should stay installed on the handlebar. Make sure to reinstall the handlebar clamp onto the top crown to keep all the pieces safe with the factory fork in the event that you'll need to reinstall these parts. Using a 15mm socket wrench, loosen the front wheel nuts to remove the front wheel assembly. Keep the axle nuts installed on the wheel. If your bike has a front fender installed, now would be a good time to remove it. Using a 6mm Allen wrench and a 13mm open wrench, remove all 3 bolts and keep these hardware for installation on the provided bracket. We recommend that the following steps be performed as a team. To remove the top crown currently installed on your SUPER73, use a 5mm Allen wrench to loosen the 2 stanchion screws and loosen the 2 steer clamp screws. Next, use an 8mm Allen wrench to remove the steer tube bolt and the steer tube cap. Now you may remove the top crown from the fork assembly. This may require the use of a mallet. Please note that the removal of the top crown may cause some of the spacers to fall out. Be prepared for this and save them for reinstallation. Phase 2. Installation of the suspension fork. Ensure the 3 screws at the lower plate of the suspension fork are tight. Tighten these to a torque of 13 feet per pound using a 5mm attachment on the torque wrench. Using a 5mm Allen wrench, loosen the screws at each stanchion clamp and the 2 screws at the steer tube clamp of the top crown and pull the top crown away from the suspension fork. Some force may be necessary. With the crown set aside from the assembly, remove the handlebar clamp using a 5mm Allen wrench for preparation of the handlebar installation. Make sure the bearing set installed on the head tube is intact and properly seated. Insert the fork onto your SUPER73 by placing the steer tube into your frame's head tube. One person should hold the fork into place while the other inserts the steer tube spacers in the following order: plastic split washer with the skinny edge facing down, metal shim if applicable, dust seal with rubber gasket, and then a 10mm spacer. Install the top crown from the suspension fork onto the fork assembly. Some force may be required, which may include the use of a rubber mallet. Insert the steer tube bolt into the steer tube cap and then tighten to the point that the fork does not easily fall in either direction. Next, tighten the stanchion screws to a torque of 13 feet per pound using a 5mm attachment on the torque wrench, making sure the preload caps have cleared the top of the crown. Install the handlebar. Place the lower crossbar into the crown, then apply the clamp over the lower crossbar. Cross-tighten the clamp screws using a 5mm Allen wrench. A final torque specification will be provided at a later instruction, and the final handlebar angle can be adjusted to rider comfort at the end of the assembly. Now begin the process of attaching the brake handles. Route the front brake handle through the left stanchion and use a 5mm Allen wrench to attach the front brake lever mount to the right handlebar, flush against the grip. The following instructions may vary based on your model. For the S series, use a 5mm Allen wrench to attach the front brake caliper to the fork at the caliper attachment without the brake caliper bracket. For the OG, you'll need the provided brake caliper bracket labeled A_M203 to attach the caliper to the fork. Attach the brake caliper bracket to the fork with the open end facing away from the fork and the lettering A_M203 reading downward. There are 2 sets of holes on the bracket. Use the lower 2 sets of holes, insert the 2 screws provided, and tighten using a 5mm Allen wrench. Now you may attach the front brake caliper from the OG to the brake caliper bracket using a 5mm Allen wrench. For the Z series, use a 5mm Allen wrench to attach the front brake caliper to the fork at the caliper attachment without the brake caliper bracket. A brake caliper alignment will be necessary once the front wheel has been installed. Route the rear brake handle through the left stanchion and attach the brake handle on the handlebar against the grip. The angle of the brake handles can be adjusted for rider's comfort. We recommend a 45-degree angle. Now secure the front brake line with the pre-installed clamp on the fork. Remove the clamp and place the brake line in the clamp and tighten the clamp into place. Now reinstall the front wheel without the washers and use a 15mm socket wrench to tighten the axle nuts. Begin making the connections by lining up the arrows of the male and female connectors and gently pushing them together. These connections are color-coded to aid in proper connection, and the connections include the main power connection of the wiring harness to the controller, both brake sensor cables, and the headlight connection if your model has an integrated headlight. To install the headlight, align the bracket to the attachment holes on the underside of the top crown. Insert both of the attachment screws and hand tighten to hold the headlight in place. Use a 5mm Allen wrench to fully tighten. For the OG, the headlight connection will be made near the cup holder and will require zip ties. If your Super73 previously had a fender kit installed, install the front fender on the provided fender bracket. Use a 6mm Allen wrench and a 13mm open wrench as well as the 3 screws from the original fender assembly. Next, use the provided hardware to attach the fender assembly to the suspension fork. Thread the washer through the screw and into the front of the bracket. Place the screw and assembly into the attachment hole of the bridge on the suspension fork and use a 5mm Allen wrench and a 10mm open wrench to tighten the nylock nut from the rear. Now to load the stanchion pressure. First, loosen the handlebar clamp without fully removing and slide the handlebar over to reveal one of the stanchion caps. Remove the stanchion cap to uncover the pressure valve. Use the shock pump to load the stanchion to the appropriate pressure. Please verify the appropriate PSI with the provided table in the support manual. Apply the cap and repeat the above process for the other stanchion. Now, tighten the handlebar clamp to a torque of 20 feet per pound with the 5mm attachment and torque wrench. Phase 3. Safety check. Make sure the wheel nuts are secure and the axle is properly seated in the dropouts. Make the necessary brake alignment for proper front braking. Ensure the handlebar is properly adjusted and secure.